The Zephyrian Empire had been moving across the galaxy for over 1,000 years. Their ships looked like giant pieces of ice floating through space. The aliens inside were made of living ice and crystal. They loved the cold and hated anything warm. Everywhere they went, they turned hot planets into frozen worlds. Captain Hyanwu had been watching the enemy ships on his radar screen for 3 days. He sat in the underground command center beneath Seoul, surrounded by dozens of other officers. The room was filled with the quiet hum of computers and the nervous breathing of people who knew they were about to fight for their lives. "Sir, they're entering our atmosphere now," said Lieutenant Ji-hai, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. She was young, maybe 25, with short black hair and tired eyes. She had been working without sleep for 2 days. Hyanwu nodded and looked at the main screen. The Zephyrian ships were huge, each one the size of a city. They moved slowly through Earth's sky like floating mountains of ice. As they descended, the temperature around them dropped rapidly. Snow began falling in places where it had never snowed before. "All units prepare for contact," Hyanwu spoke into his headset. Around the world, millions of human soldiers were getting ready to fight. They had tanks, planes, and missiles. But none of them had ever fought enemies like this before. The first attack came at sunrise. The Zephyrians didn't use bullets or bombs. Instead, they fired beams of pure cold. When these beams hit buildings, the structures instantly froze solid. When they hit people, those people became ice statues in seconds. The sound was terrible, like glass breaking mixed with thunder in the city above. Sergeant Borum was leading her squad through the streets when the attack began. She watched in horror as a blue beam struck a school bus. The vehicle and everyone inside turned to ice immediately. The frozen bus slid down the icy street and crashed into a building. "Fall back. Fall back," she shouted to her soldiers, but there was nowhere to go. The cold beams were coming from every direction. The aliens were freezing entire city blocks at once. Major Dongman was in charge of the artillery units on the hills outside Seoul. His cannons fired shell after shell at the enemy ships, but the explosions had no effect. The ice armor on the alien ships was too thick. Even worse, every time a shell exploded near them, the cold from the ships made the explosions smaller and weaker. "It's like trying to fight winter itself," he radioed to command. Around him, his soldiers were shivering. The temperature had dropped to -20 degrees in just 1 hour. Dr. Minho was in his laboratory when the attack started. He was a scientist who studied metals and how they behaved in extreme heat. As he watched the news reports, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The enemy weapons weren't just freezing things, they were changing the basic properties of matter itself. "They're not just making things cold," he whispered to his assistant Saul Young. "They're removing heat energy completely. This is impossible with our current understanding of physics." The battle lasted only 6 hours. By the end, most of Earth's major cities were covered in ice. The Zephyrians had weapons that could freeze entire neighborhoods in minutes. Their soldiers, made of living ice, could walk through the coldest places on Earth without any protection. Captain Hyanwu received the final reports from around the world. Tokyo was frozen, New York was frozen. London, Paris, Moscow, all frozen. The enemy had won faster than anyone thought possible. "Sir," said Lieutenant Ji-hai, "we're receiving surrender requests from every major government." But Hyanwu wasn't ready to give up. He looked at the thermal readings from deep underground. The Earth's core was still hot. The geothermal vents were still working. The volcanic areas were still warm. "Send a message to all remaining forces," he said. "Anyone who can move, head for the thermal zones. Underground caverns, volcanic areas, anywhere there's natural heat." As the last human soldiers retreated into the depths of their planet, the Zephyrians began building their ice cities on the surface. They thought the war was over. They thought they had won another easy victory. But deep below, in the warm places where the Earth's fire still burned, something was happening. The humans weren't just hiding. They were planning. They were learning. And most importantly, they were getting angry. The Zephyrians had made one critical mistake. They assumed that because they had conquered the surface, They had conquered humanity. Out. But humans had always been creatures of fire and heat. They discovered fire before they discovered the wheel. They had built civilizations around warmth. Now, driven underground by an enemy made of ice, they were about to remember what their ancestors had always known. The hottest fires burn in the darkest places. And humanity was about to show the galaxy what that really meant. The conquest was complete. But the real war was just beginning. 3 months had passed since the ice came from the sky. The world above was silent now, covered in a thick layer of frost that never melted. But deep beneath the Korean peninsula, in the warm caves near old volcanic sites, humanity was still alive. Dr. Minho wiped the sweat from his forehead as he worked at his makeshift forge. The cave was hot, filled with the natural steam from underground hot springs. Around him, other survivors had built a small underground city. They used the Earth's natural heat to power their lights and warm their shelters. "The metal is ready," he called to Engineer Soyoung, who was waiting with a bucket of water. She had been a bridge builder before the war. Now she was learning to make weapons from melted car parts and old kitchen knives. Soyoung watched as Minho pulled a glowing piece of steel from the fire. It was bright orange, almost white with heat. When he dipped it in the water, it hissed and sent up a cloud of steam. "It's getting hotter than before," she said. "Much hotter than normal steel should get." Minho nodded. He had been experimenting for weeks, trying to understand what was happening. The metal wasn't just getting hot, it was somehow storing heat energy in ways that shouldn't be possible. "I think being underground is changing how we work with fire," he said. "The Earth's heat is doing something to us." In another part of the cave system, Sergeant Bioram was training a group of children. They were kids who had lost their families in the attack. The youngest was only 8 years old. The oldest was 16. None of them had seen sunlight in 3 months. "Hold the metal rod like this," Bioram showed them. The rod was warm, heated by the volcanic vents. "Feel how the heat moves through it. Don't fight it. Work with it." A boy named Jun Ho held the rod carefully. He was 12. Small for his age, but his eyes were bright with curiosity. "It feels alive," he whispered. "Like it wants to be hotter." Boram smiled. The children were adapting faster than the adults. They seemed to understand heat in ways that grown-ups had forgotten. Some of them could hold metal that was too hot for adults to touch. Others could make fires burn brighter just by concentrating on them. Lieutenant Yuan-ji was in charge of the food supply. She worked in the deepest part of the caves, where the heat was strongest. The survivors had learned to cook food in ways their grandparents never imagined. They could bake bread by holding it near the hot rocks. They could boil water by focusing the heat from the volcanic vents. "We're not just surviving," she told Captain Hyan-woo during their daily meeting. "We're changing, becoming something new." Hyan-woo had noticed it too. The survivors were different now. They moved differently, thought differently. They had been living with constant heat for months, and it was changing them. Their skin could handle temperatures that would have burned them before. Their eyes could see in the red glow of the forges. Their hands could shape hot metal without tools. Dr. Minho had been studying these changes. He kept notes in a journal made from pages torn from old books. "I think the volcanic heat is activating something in our DNA," he explained to the other leaders. "Something that was always there, but never needed before." Young-soo, who had been a factory worker before the war, was now their best metalsmith. He could make knives that stayed sharp longer, tools that never broke, and armor that was lighter but stronger than anything they had made before. "The heat talks to me," he said simply. "I just listen and do what it says." It's the most surprising. Change was in the children. They were learning to do things that seemed impossible. Little Haewon could start fires with her bare hands. Taehyun could make metal glow without putting it in the forge. Subin could heat water to boiling just by holding the container. "They're not afraid of the heat like we were," observed Soyoung. "They grew up with it. It's natural to them." The adult survivors were learning too, but more slowly. They had to forget years of being careful around fire and heat. They had to learn to trust the flames that had once scared them. It was hard work, but they were motivated by something stronger than fear. Above them, the ice world continued. The Zephyrians had built their crystal cities on the frozen surface.
Ow.
They believed the humans were dead or dying in the cold. Had no idea that beneath their feet, humanity was being reborn in fire. The survivors worked every day, learning new skills, making new tools, and most importantly, teaching their children. They were preparing for something, though they didn't know exactly what yet. They just knew that the heat was making them stronger, and that someday they would return to the surface. The Zephyrians had thought that freezing the Earth would end the human story. But they had forgotten that humans came from a planet with a molten core. They had forgotten that fire was older than ice, and that some flames never go out. In the depths of the Earth, humanity was learning to burn brighter than ever before. 3 years had passed since the ice came. The Zephyrian commander Velthak stood on the observation deck of his ice fortress near what used to be Moscow. The structure was beautiful, walls of pure crystal that reached high into the frozen sky. Ice soldiers patrolled the perimeter, their bodies glowing with cold blue light. Another quiet day, Velthak said to his lieutenant. The humans have been silent for months. I believe they are finally extinct. Below the fortress, buried deep in the Earth's warm places, something very different was happening. Captain Jae-soon checked his new armor one last time. It was unlike anything humans had ever made before. The metal was dark red, almost black, but it glowed from within like it had fire trapped inside. Temperature check, he said into his radio. Armor running at 800 degrees, replied Specialist Young-soo from the control room. All systems good, Jae-sung nodded. The armor was hot enough to melt steel, but it felt comfortable on his skin. After 3 years of living underground with constant heat, his body had adapted. He could touch red-hot metal with his bare hands and feel only warmth around him. 50 other soldiers were putting on similar armor. Each suit was handmade by the survivors, forged in the deepest caves where the Earth's heat was strongest. The armor didn't just protect them, it was a weapon. Corporal Hae-won was the youngest soldier in the group. She was only 19, but she had spent 3 years learning to work with heat and metal. Her armor was different from the others. It was white-hot, glowing like a small star. When she moved, the air around her shimmered with heat waves, remember Jae-sung told his team. We're not trying to hide anymore. We want them to see us coming. We want them to know what heat can do. The attack began at dawn. The Zephyrian guards on the fortress walls were the first to notice something wrong. The snow around the base of their fortress was melting. Not slowly, like snow melts in spring, but rapidly turning to steam in seconds. Alert! Alert! One guard shouted. Unknown heat source approaching from the south. Then they saw them. 50 human figures walking across the frozen ground, their armor glowing. Like hot coals, where they stepped, the ice melted away. The air around them was so hot it created a fog of steam. Young Dash-soo carried a weapon that looked like a simple metal tube. But when he pointed it at the fortress wall, a stream of liquid fire shot out. The crystal wall, which had been strong enough to stop missiles, began to melt like ice cream on a hot day. It's possible, Velthak shouted from his command center. Nothing can generate that much heat. Their technology was primitive. But the humans weren't using technology the way the Zephyrians understood it. They had learned to work with heat as if it were a living thing. Their weapons didn't just make fire. They focused and controlled the Earth's own heat energy. Hae-won walked straight toward the main gate. The metal doors were designed to withstand extreme cold, but they had never been tested against extreme heat. When she placed her glowing hands on the door, it began to melt immediately. The metal ran like water, leaving a hole big enough for the entire team to walk through. Inside the fortress, the ice soldiers tried to fight back. They fired their cold beams at the humans, but something strange happened. The beams made the human armor glow brighter instead of freezing it. Cold energy was being absorbed and turned into heat. They're using our own weapons against us, an ice soldier reported Jae-sung, and his team moved through the fortress like they were walking through their own home. The walls melted around them. The floors turned to water under their feet. The beautiful crystal decorations became puddles of liquid. The Zephyrians had never experienced fear like this. For 1,000 years, they had been the ones who brought cold death to warm worlds. Now they were facing beings who brought heat that could not be stopped. Young-Su found the fortress's main power core. It was a massive crystal that generated the cold energy for all their weapons. He placed his hand on it, and the crystal began to crack from the heat. Within seconds, it shattered completely, and the fortress's defensive systems shut down. "This is impossible," Velthak whispered as he watched his fortress collapse. "We studied your species. You were weak. You used primitive fire and simple machines." Jae-sung removed his helmet, revealing a face that had been changed by years of living. With constant heat, his eyes glowed faintly red, and his skin had a bronze color that seemed to come from within. "You're right," he said. "We were weak. But you made a mistake. You pushed us underground where the real fire lives. You taught us what we could become." The battle lasted only 2 hours. When it was over, the fortress was nothing but a puddle of water and melted metal. The Zephyrians who survived spread the word across their empire. The humans were not extinct. They'd become something new, something that turned cold into heat and ice into steam. The war was about to begin again. But this time, humanity would be bringing the fire. The news of the Moscow fortress spread across the Zephyrian Empire like cracks in breaking ice. Emperor Kethval sat in his crystal throne room on the ice world of Zephyr Prime, surrounded by his most trusted generals. The room was so cold that the air itself seemed to sparkle with frost. "Show me the reports again," he commanded. General Morden activated the holographic display. Images showed the melted remains of what had been their strongest fortress on Earth. "The humans have developed weapons that generate extreme heat. Our ice armor is useless against them." "Wheat weapons," Kethval said slowly, "but their technology was primitive. How did they advance so quickly?" "We believe they didn't advance, my lord," Morden replied. "We believe they changed. The survivors who attacked the fortress moved differently. They seemed to be immune to cold, and they generated heat from their own bodies." On Earth, the human resistance had grown stronger. Colonel Taehyun stood in the main command center, now built in a volcanic cave system beneath Mount Fuji. The walls glowed with natural heat, and the air was thick with steam. Maps covered every surface, showing Zephyrian positions across the planet. "We have reports from 12 different attack teams," he said to his officers. "Every ice fortress we've hit has fallen within hours. The enemy is starting to retreat from the coastal areas." Lieutenant Suben, who had become their best pilot, studied the aerial reconnaissance photos. "They're pulling back to the polar regions. They think the cold will protect them there." Taehyun smiled grimly. "They still don't understand. The cold isn't going to save them anymore." The next major battle happened in Antarctica, where the Zephyrians had built their largest base on Earth. The ice fortress there was massive, the size of a small city, with walls hundreds of feet thick. The aliens believed it was impossible to attack because of the extreme cold. But pilot Subin had been working with the engineers to create something new. Her fighter plane had been completely rebuilt using the heat-focused metal technology. The engines didn't just propel the aircraft, they turned it into a flying furnace. "Target in sight," she radioed as her plane approached the Antarctic base. The outside temperature was -50 degrees, but her cockpit was warm and comfortable. Her modified flight suit regulated heat the same way the ground troops' armor did. As her plane flew over the ice fortress, something extraordinary happened. The heat from her engines was so intense that it melted the ice and snow for miles around. The fortress, which had been hidden under thick ice sheets, suddenly became visible as the frozen covering turned to steam. "Impossible," the fortress commander shouted. "Nothing can generate that much heat in these temperatures." But Subin's plane was just the beginning. Behind her came a squadron of 20 more heat-powered fighters. Together, they turned the Antarctic sky into a cloud of superheated steam. The ice fortress began to crack and collapse as its frozen foundation melted away. On the ground, Sergeant Borum led a team of soldiers who had been training in the deepest volcanic caves. They moved across the melting ice like they were walking on solid ground. Their armor was so hot that they left footprints of melted ice behind them. "The main defensive wall is down," BORM reported. Moving to the central command structure, the Zephyrian defenders tried everything they could think of. They fired their most powerful cold beams at the humans, but the beams only made the human armor glow brighter. They tried to flood the area with supercooled air. but the humans' heat turned it into harmless steam, most terrifying of all. The humans seemed to be getting stronger as the battle continued. Every time they absorbed cold energy from the Zephyrian weapons, they converted it into heat energy. They were literally feeding off their enemies' attacks. Private Dayun, one of the youngest soldiers, walked straight through a wall of ice that was supposed to be impenetrable. The wall melted around her like she was made of lava. "This is easier than training," she said into her radio. The battle ended when Bioram's team reached the fortress's central power core. It was a massive crystal that generated cold energy for the entire base. When the humans surrounded it, their combined heat output was so intense that the crystal didn't just crack, it exploded into steam. "Base destruction confirmed," Bioram reported. "No survivors." Back on Zephyr Prime, Emperor Kethval received the news in stunned silence. His greatest fortress on Earth had been destroyed by a handful of humans who seemed to be immune to cold and capable of generating unlimited heat. "How many of them are there?" he asked. "Unknown, my lord. But intelligence suggests they're not just fighting us, they're changing other humans too. Every victory makes them stronger, and every human who joins them gains the same abilities." Kethval stared at the tactical display showing Earth. Red dots marked human activity, and there were more appearing every day. The planet that had been frozen solid just 3 years ago was now warming up. The humans weren't just fighting back. They were reclaiming their world, one melted fortress at a time. "Prepare the fleet," he commanded. "We're going to Earth personally. It's time to end this before it spreads further." The heat of battle was changing everything, and the Zephyrians were about to learn what that really meant. The Zephyrian Imperial fleet emerged from hyperspace near Earth like a storm of crystalline death. 300 warships, each one the size of a mountain, surrounded the blue planet. Emperor Kethval stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching Earth through the viewing screen. The planet looked different now. Patches of green and brown were visible where there had once been only white ice. "The humans have managed to warm their world," he said to his fleet commander. "But they cannot warm the vacuum of space. It will destroy them from orbit." On Earth, Admiral Wujin Kim received the reports from his space monitoring stations. He stood in the command center built deep inside Mount Vesuvius, where the lava flows provided unlimited heat energy. Around him, his officers worked at control panels that glowed with their own internal fire. 300 ships, reported Lieutenant Commander Dayun. "They're taking positions for orbital bombardment." Wujin nodded calmly. "Launch the Phoenix Squadron." High above Earth, something unprecedented began to happen. Human ships rose from the planet's surface, but they weren't like any spacecraft the galaxy had ever seen. These vessels didn't use chemical rockets or ion drives. They flew by riding controlled nuclear explosions, their hulls glowing white-hot as they climbed toward space. Pilot Junho sat in the cockpit of his fighter, watching the temperature gauges climb higher and higher. His ship, the Soulfire, was essentially a flying star. The cabin temperature was over 1,000 degrees, but his modified body handled it easily. He had been born in the underground cities and had never known cold. "Phoenix leader to all units," he radioed. "Remember, we're not just fighting for Earth, we're fighting for the right to be warm." The space battle that followed defied everything the Zephyrians knew about warfare. The human ships moved through space like meteors, trailing fire behind them. When the Zephyrians fired their cold beams, the human vessels absorbed the energy and converted it into even more heat. "Can't possible!" shouted the Zephyrian fleet commander. "Their ships should be frozen solid in the vacuum of space." But the humans had learned to carry their heat with them. Their ships were powered by the same volcanic energy that had sustained them underground. They had turned their spacecraft into mobile furnaces that could survive anywhere Young-Su. Flying a ship called Mountain Fire, dove straight toward the enemy flagship. The Zephyrian defensive beams struck his hull, but instead of freezing his ship, they made it glow brighter. He fired his main weapon, a focused beam of pure thermal energy that could melt asteroids. The beam struck the crystalline hull of the enemy ship, and something extraordinary happened. The ice-based armor didn't just melt, it exploded into superheated steam. The entire section of the ship disappeared in a cloud of vapor. Emperor Kethval watched in horror as his fleet was systematically destroyed. Ship after ship fell to the human thermal weapons. His warriors, bred for 1,000 generations to fight in the cold of space, were helpless against enemies who brought the heat of stars with them. "My lord," his aide reported, "the humans are requesting a meeting. They want to talk." Talk? Kethfel was confused. They're winning. Why would they want to talk? The meeting took place on a neutral station between the fleets. Admiral Wu Jin arrived wearing a simple uniform that radiated gentle warmth. When Emperor Kethfal saw him, the ice being stepped back instinctively. The human was like a walking furnace, but his heat felt somehow welcoming. "You could destroy us now," Kethfel said, his voice crackling like breaking ice. "Why don't you?" Wu Jin smiled. "Because we learned something important during our years underground. Heat isn't just about destruction. It's about life, growth, and change. We want to share that with you." Share. Kethfal didn't understand. "You want to make us warm?" "Not exactly," Wu Jin explained. "We want to show you that heat and cold don't have to be enemies. They can work together. Your ice technology combined with our thermal science could create something amazing." Over the following months, something remarkable happened. Human engineers worked alongside Zephyrian scientists to develop new technologies. They created ships that could regulate temperature perfectly, going from the heat of a star's core to the cold of deep space in seconds. They built cities that were comfortable for both ice beings and fire-adapted humans. Dr. Minho, the head of the Joint Research Project, stood in a laboratory that was half volcanic cave and half crystal. "Palace, we're not just making peace," he told his mixed team of human and Zephyrian scientists. "We're making something new." The galaxy watched in amazement as the war between ice and fire became a partnership. Other species began to understand that conflict wasn't always necessary. Sometimes the greatest enemies could become the strongest allies. Emperor Kethfel, now working closely with the human leadership, made a speech that was broadcast across the galaxy. "We thought that cold was the ultimate power. We were wrong. We thought that heat was our enemy. We're wrong about that too. The ultimate power is balance." The Zephyrians had thought it was over when they conquered Earth. They had been wrong about what humans could become. They had also been wrong about what hot truly meant. It wasn't just about temperature. It was about the fire of life itself, the heat of determination, and the warmth of hope. In the end, the galaxy became a warmer place.